The after-action record calls it a routine sustainment movement interrupted by adverse weather. 41 vehicles, one displacement of a forward supply element, a haboob that came up off the collet hardpan faster than the forecast allowed. 2 paragraphs. A casualty annex with a name in it that should not have been there, and 3 names that should have been and weren't. I have read that record more times than I will admit, the way a man keeps pressing on a tooth that aches, and every time I get to the line where the recovery was suspended, I have to put the paper down and breathe. Because I am the one who wrote that line. Staff Sergeant Delwyn Brunner, Recovery NCO, Task Force Verand. I signed off on the stand down. I have spent the years since learning exactly what it costs to be the man who decided the wind was stronger than the obligation, and I am going to tell it the way it happened, because the version in the record is clean, and nothing about that day was clean. I was 34 that spring, 11 years in, a vehicle recovery and convoy man to the bone. I knew dust. I had pulled trucks out of wadis and off shoulders and out from under their own rolled weight in 3 countries, and I believed, the way you believe in gravity, that I knew what the desert would and wouldn't do. Camp Varen sat on a shelf of packed gravel and salt at the throat of a corridor that fed everything forward: fuel, water, ammunition, the parts that kept the line alive. We were not the spear, we were the shaft of it. The men who came through Verand on their way to the fight looked at us the way you look at a gas station, necessary, forgettable, beneath remark. I had made a kind of peace with that. The work was honest. The work mattered whether or not anyone said so. The convoy that morning was nothing unusual on the manifest. A supply displacement pushing northwest to a strongpoint called Ledge, 41 vehicles, fuelers and water buffaloes and flatbeds and the gun trucks to wrap them. There was an inspecting officer riding along, somebody from the sustainment staff doing a line walk, the kind of thing that happened often enough that nobody briefed it twice. A logistics lieutenant, the manifest said. Riding in the 3rd serial to look at how the supply line was actually run versus how the slides said it was run. I remember thinking, when I saw the line item, that I pitied whoever had to sit in a fuel truck for 9 hours to count pallets. I did not give the inspecting officer a second thought. I want that on the record too, because it is the first sin in a day full of them. I looked right at the line that said an officer was riding with us, and I decided she did not matter. We knew that much. The staff had passed it down with the manifest, and a couple of the younger men had made the kind of remarks young men make, and I had told them to knock it off, not because I was better than them but because I was tired and it was early. A woman from the sustainment shop, riding to inspect a supply route. In my head she was a clipboard with boots on. I built a whole person out of nothing and got her completely wrong. And the desert was about to teach me that I had no idea who had walked through my motor pool that morning with dust already on her collar, and a canteen worn soft at the seams like she had carried it a long way before any of us met her. I should say more about that morning, because it is the part I go back to most, the 10 minutes I have replayed until they have worn smooth as a creek stone. The convoy formed up in the recovery yard's overflow before dawn, the way every big movement formed, and I was out among the trucks in the cold doing what I always did, which was walk the recovery vehicles and the tow points and check that if anything in that column died on the road, I had a way to bring it home. There is a smell to a motor pool before a movement, diesel and cold metal and the dust that never fully settles, the particular tang of brake parts and old coolant, and I knew it the way you know the smell of your own kitchen. The men moved in the half-dark with red lens flashlights, checking loads, throwing straps, the gun truck crews mounting their weapons with that flat metallic clatter that means the morning is about to get serious. I had a clipboard. I always had a clipboard. I have come to hate the clipboard in memory, the way you hate a thing that was innocent and became the instrument of your failure. She came up to me out of that half-dark and asked me a question, and I answered it without looking up. I have to be exact about this because it is the hinge of my whole account. A figure in coalition camo with a soft old canteen on her belt and dust already worked into the collar. Dust, before the column had even rolled, which should have told me something if I had been the kind of man who reads people instead of manifests, stopped at my elbow and asked me plainly, in a level, unhurried voice, where the recovery rally point was if the column had to consolidate on the road. It was a good question. It was, I understand now, exactly the question a commander inspecting a supply line would ask. The question of someone who has thought about what happens when a plan meets weather. The question almost no junior officer thinks to ask because junior officers assume the plan holds. And I gave her the grid off my clipboard, brisk, the way you answer a tourist who has asked you for directions you have given 100 times, and I did not look up. And she said, "Thank you, Sergeant," in that same level voice. And she walked back to the third serial and climbed into a fuel truck, and I went back to my straps. That was the whole of it. 10 seconds. I have built monuments out of those 10 seconds since. The commander of the entire task force asked me a careful, professional question in the dark, and I gave her a grid without lifting my eyes, because I had already decided what she was, and what she was furniture. Here is the thing about being the shaft and not the spear. You learn to disappear. You learn that the men going forward to the fight do not see you, and after enough years you start to not see in the same way. You stop looking hard at the people who come through your yard because they are all passing through, all on their way to somewhere that matters more than where you stand. I had let that habit calcify into something close to a creed. I told myself it was humility. It was not humility. It was a failure of attention dressed up as humility, and the desert was about to make me pay for the difference. Because the one morning it would have cost me nothing to look up and see who was standing at my elbow, I kept my eyes on a clipboard, and I have never been allowed to forget it. The storm was not on the forecast as a storm. It was on the forecast as a chance of blowing dust, the kind of line that meant goggles and a wet rag over your mouth, an inconvenience. I have learned since that the hard pan out past ledge does something with heat and the low ground and the seasonal wind that the models never quite catch, and that the men who had been in that country longest didn't trust the morning sky no matter what the slide said. I was not one of those men. I trusted the slide. The convoy rolled at 6:10 with the sun coming up hard and flat and orange, and by 900 the radio traffic was ordinary, position reports, a fueler with a soft tire, the small weather of a long movement. By 10:40, the horizon to the southwest had gone the color of a bruise. I was back at Varand in the recovery yard when the wall came. I have seen dust storms. I had never seen anything like the thing that came up off the collet that day. It did not roll in. It stood up. A cliff of ochre 2,000 feet tall climbing the sky from the ground up, eating the sun, eating the horizon, eating the strongpoint at ledge off the map in the space of a few minutes. The light went brown and then went out. The wind hit Varan and the whole camp leaned into it, tense drumming, a sheet of corrugate skating across the yard like a playing card. My radio, patched to the convoy net, turned to a churn of static and broken voices, serials calling for halt, a gun truck commander trying to hold his element, a young driver saying he couldn't see the truck in front of him, then saying he couldn't see his own hood, then saying nothing at all, and the not saying was worse than anything he could have said. What a sandstorm does to a convoy is it dissolves it. The thing that makes a convoy strong, the line, the spacing, the order, every vehicle a known distance from the next, the dust takes all of it. You cannot see the truck ahead, so you slow, and the truck behind cannot see you slow, and somebody stops and somebody doesn't, and the neat steel spine of the column comes apart into 41 separate blind animals stumbling in a brown roar. Some halt, some creep, some turn, thinking they are following the road, and the road is a rumor. Trucks drift off the hardpan into soft sand and bog. Drivers lose the bearing entirely. In 11 years I had seen a convoy get strung out. I had never seen one erased, and that is the only word for what the net told me was happening out there in the dark at midday. Task Force Varan's supply column was being erased, vehicle by vehicle, voice by voice, until the net itself went to a hiss. We mobilized recovery the instant the wall passed Varan, which was the wrong instinct and the only instinct, because you cannot drive into a thing like that. I had 4 wreckers and a medical track, and a security element staged at the gate with engines running and nowhere to go. Men in goggles and rags watching a brown nothing where the corridor used to be. All of us straining to push out, and all of us knowing that to push out was to add our own vehicles to the count of the lost. So we waited. We waited with the engines running and the radio screaming and my hands aching on the wheel. And waiting was the hardest soldiering I had done up to that hour, and it would not stay the hardest for long. I have thought a great deal about those 3 hours of waiting, because they were a kind of preview of the failure to come, a smaller version of the same arithmetic. We sat at the gate with the engines running and the radio screaming, and we did not go out. And not going out was correct. To drive 4 wreckers into a wall like that was to lose 4 wreckers and their crews and recover nothing. And the correctness of it did not make it bearable. A young corporal beside me kept asking me when we were going to roll, and I kept telling him not yet, and he could not understand how I could sit there with men's voices breaking up on the net and not move, and I told him the thing my own first sergeant had told me years before, which is that a dead recovery team recovers nobody. That the discipline of waiting until you can actually help is the hardest discipline there is, and the one that separates the men who bring people home from the men who become casualties trying. I believed it. I still believe it. And I have had to live with the fact that the same logic, the cold, correct logic of not spending yourself on a probably lost cause in bad conditions, is the exact logic Spare used a few hours later to leave her in the sand, and that I have no clean way to say the logic was right at the gate and wrong on the corridor, except that it was, except that somewhere between the wall of dust and the boot print the math stopped being arithmetic and started being a moral question. And I got the moral question wrong. The net during those hours was the worst thing I have ever listened to. A convoy coming apart in a storm does not go silent all at once. It goes silent in pieces. You hear the gun trucks trying to hold their elements, calm at first, then strained, then gone. You hear a driver report he has lost visual on the truck ahead, and you hear the discipline in his voice, and then 20 minutes later you hear the discipline crack just slightly, just at the edges, and then you do not hear him at all. You hear someone calling a halt that half the column cannot hear over the wind. You hear position reports that make no sense because the men giving them have lost the bearing and do not yet know it. And under all of it, you hear the wind itself in the open mics, a vast tearing roar that is somehow worse than any human voice, the sound of the desert dismantling the careful steel order we had pushed out into it that morning. I sat at the gate and listened to a task force erased 1 transmission at a time, and I could do nothing, and that helplessness was the ground out of which the rest of the day grew. The storm ran for the better part of 3 hours. When it finally thinned, late in the afternoon, the corridor northwest of Varand looked like the floor of a drained sea. Trucks scattered across 2 miles of hardpan at every angle, some upright, some canted into drifts, some simply stopped where the driver had lost his nerve and his bearing in the same breath. We rolled the moment the visibility came up, 4 wreckers and the medics and the guns, and we spent what was left of the light pulling our people in. It is a particular kind of work, going truck to truck after a thing like that, not knowing as you come up on each cab whether you will find a man shaken or a man hurt or a man you went to school with sitting very still with his eyes open and the dust already settling on him. We found mostly the living. The drivers had done what drivers do. They had stopped, most of them, and ridden it out, and they came up out of those cabs gray and coughing and grabbing our sleeves. We accounted for serial after serial. We pulled the bogged trucks free and married up the strays and walked the line counting heads against the manifest, and as the count came together, I let myself believe, for about an hour, that the collet had taken our column apart and given it all back. The recovery itself was the work I knew best in the world, and I will set it down plainly, because it is the counterweight to what came after proof that I was, on the ordinary scale of things, good at my job, which is what makes my one failure that day so hard to carry. We worked the wreckers in pairs, one to anchor and one to pull, reading each bogged truck for how it had gone in, nose first into soft sand, wants a different rig than a truck that has slid sideways off the hardpan and settled on its frame. We dug. We boarded the wheels with the planking we carried for exactly this. We ran the cables and set the shackles and took the strain slow, always slow, because a winch cable under load is a thing that kills men who hurry it, and we brought truck after truck back onto firm ground in the failing light. I had a corporal characterize each pull before we made it, how deep, what angle, what the ground was, the same way I'd want a failure characterized before I trusted any fix, and we worked down the scattered column methodically, and it was good work, clean work, the kind of recovery you are proud of. We gave the collet a hard argument that evening, and we won most of it. We just did not win all of it, and the part we lost was the part that mattered, and no amount of competence at the rigging changed the fact that when the math came due on the one survivor walking, I folded. It had not given all of it back. As the dark came down and the head count firmed, 3 names had no faces to put against them. A young private named Aller, a driver. A specialist whose truck we found nosed into a drift a mile off the route, empty, the door open, his tracks already gone under the wind. And the inspecting officer. The lieutenant from sustainment, the clipboard I had built in my head, who had been riding in the 3rd serial, and whose fuel truck we found on its side in soft sand 2 miles southwest of where any truck should have been. The cab crushed down on the low side. No one in it. A smear of blood dried black on the bent door frame, and a single boot print leading away into ground the wind had already smoothed to glass. That is where the record and my memory begin to argue. The record says the recovery was suspended at 21:30 owing to deteriorating conditions and the assessed low probability of survival. My memory says it differently. My memory says I stood in the wash of my wrecker's headlights with that boot print at my feet, the one print before the wind ate the rest, and I knew, the way you know a thing in your gut before your head will say it, that someone had climbed out of that crushed cab under their own power and walked. Hurt maybe, bleeding certainly from the look of the door, but walked. And I keyed my radio to tell Varen that I had a survivor moving on foot, and I wanted to expand the search. And the answer that came back closed the door on the rest of my life. The voice on the net was the task force commander himself, Colonel All Despair. He was a hard, dry, careful man who ran Varen like a ledger, and I will not pretend he was a villain, because he wasn't, and the easy version where he is one lets me off a hook I have not earned. He had a corridor full of scattered vehicles, fuel and water and ammunition strewn across the open, a second storm cell building on the forecast, and an enemy that liked nothing better than a coalition column caught with its line undone. He had hard choices and not enough night to make them in. I have run his math 100 times since, and I understand every figure in it. Understanding it has never once made it sit easier. He came up on the net and he asked me for a status, and I gave it to him straight. 2 recovered dead, the specialist still missing, the inspecting officer missing on foot with sign of a survivor leaving the wreck. I told him I had a boot print. I told him I wanted to push the security element out in a search line to the southwest, along the bearing of that print before the wind took everything. And Colonel Spare was quiet for a moment on the net, and then he said the thing I have carried ever since. He said the corridor was the priority, that he would not strip his security off scattered Class III and Class V to chase one set of tracks across open ground in the dark with a second cell coming, that the assessed probability of a lone survivor making it through a call at night was not worth the fuel and the risk to the living. One logistics officer, he said, was not worth losing a recovery team over. Mark her with the missing. Consolidate the corridor. Stand the search down. I want to tell you I argued harder. I argued. I told him about the print, about the door, about the blood that meant she'd been moving when she left. I told him I could take 2 wreckers and the medics on the bearing and be back before the cell hit. And he told me, in the flat voice of a man who has already decided and is only waiting for you to stop talking, that it was an order. Stand down. consolidate. We would mark the corridor at first light and recover what vehicles we could, and the missing would be carried as missing. And that was the war, Sergeant, and I would do my job. So I did my job. I turned my wreckers around. I drove away from that boot print with my headlights swinging across the smooth sand, and I told myself the colonel had the bigger picture and I had only a print in the dust, and I almost believed it, and I have never forgiven myself for the part of me that almost did. Back inside the wire that night, I watched them do the paperwork. There is a coldness to how an army accounts for a person it has decided to stop looking for. A clerk struck her line from the active recovery roster and moved it to the missing annex with 2 keystrokes. Somewhere up the staff chain, quietly, her duties were reassigned. The inspecting authority she'd been carrying handed off to another officer, so the supply line would have its oversight whether or not she ever came back, the bureaucratic equivalent of folding a dead man's chair against the table. I did not understand the weight of that reassignment at the time. I thought I was watching them shuffle a lieutenant's clipboard to someone else's desk. I was watching them quietly relieve a commander none of them knew they had, sign her authority away to a subordinate while she lay out in the dark 40 miles from anyone, alive, and already in our ledgers gone. I did not sleep. I sat in the recovery yard with a cup of coffee gone cold, and I looked out at the corridor where the second cell never came. The forecast was wrong about that too, and I thought about the door of that fuel truck and the single boot print, and the smoothed glass of the sand where the rest of the tracks should have been. I told myself she was probably already gone, that the colonel's math was probably right, that a hurt officer alone on the collet at night was a body we had not found yet. I told myself that, and out past the wire, in the cold that comes down hard on the hardpan after the sun quits, the officer we had written off was not a body. She was awake. She was taking stock. And she was about to begin doing, alone and on foot and bleeding, the thing that the entire apparatus of Task Force Varan had just decided was not worth the fuel. I want to slow down on the suspension order, because it is the spine of my shame and because the easy telling of it lies. The easy telling makes Spare a tyrant and me a good soldier overruled, and neither is true. The hard telling is that I had a choice in it too, smaller than his but real, and I made the safe one. When his voice came back over the net telling me to stand down, I had 2 wreckers and a medical track and a security squad, and I had a bearing, and I had the better part of a night before the cell that never came. I could have argued past the first refusal. I could have asked for 30 minutes and 1 wrecker. I could have done what every recovery man swears in his heart he will always do, which is go back for the 1 more, and I did not, because going back for the 1 more meant defying a colonel on an open net in front of my men over a boot print, and the part of me that wanted to be a good soldier and keep my stripes and not be wrong in public won out over the part of me that knew what that print meant. I dressed it up. I told myself the colonel had the picture and I had the print. But underneath the dressing was a simpler thing. I was afraid to be the man who was wrong, so I became the man who left her. That night in the recovery yard, I did the small rituals a man does when he cannot sleep and cannot forgive himself yet. I cleaned the gear that did not need cleaning. I walked the wreckers and checked the winch cables and the tow bars in the dark with a red lens, the same walk I had done that morning, and every coil of cable and every shackle was an accusation. I went over the manifest by flashlight, the dead and the missing, and I made myself read her line in the missing annex, the line that said only inspecting officer, sustainment, and a service number. And I told myself I felt nothing because I did not know her, and that was a lie too, because you do not have to know a person to have failed them. I had stood over the 1 boot print she left in the world, and I had understood it correctly, and I had driven away. Knowing her name would not have changed the print. The print was enough. The print said someone walked, and I knew it, and I left. The clerk who moved her line did it without malice, which is somehow worse than malice. He was a tired specialist running a hot war room at the end of a bad day, and to him she was a keystroke, a line that moved from one annex to another, and the casual administrative violence of it. The way an army turns a living person into a status field is a thing I had seen 100 times and never once felt until that night, when I watched a man my own age fold a commander's chair against the table with 2 taps and a yawn and go back to his coffee. I did not blame him. I have never blamed him. He did exactly what the system told him to do, and the system told him she was probably dead and the corridor was the priority, and the system was running its math the same as Spare, the same as me. All of us moving the decimal points around a person who was at that hour very much alive and very much alone, doing the arithmetic of her own survival out past the wire, while we did the arithmetic of writing her off inside it. She came to in the dark with the taste of blood in her mouth and the truck on its side above her, and the first thing she did, she told me much later in the flat plain way she told everything, was inventory. Not panic, inventory. What hurt and how much. What worked. What was within reach. A gash along the hairline where her head had met the door frame, bleeding the way scalp wounds bleed, frightening and not fatal. A left wrist that took her weight wrong and sang when she used it. Ribs that caught at the bottom of a breath. Boots on. 1 canteen still on her belt, the soft old one, maybe half. The cab crushed down on the low side and the driver, she said this part very quietly, the driver gone, beyond her help and nothing to be done for him but what little dignity she could manage in the dark before she climbed out into the wind that was still tearing the world apart. She did not climb out and run. There was nowhere to run to and she knew it, which is the first thing that separated her from the lieutenant I had invented. She got clear of the wreck and she got low, and she waited out the worst of the storm in the lee of the truck's belly, hoarding what warmth and water she had, because she understood, the way the men who'd been in that country longest understood, that the desert kills the people who fight it and spares, sometimes, the ones who read it. Before she left the wreck she did one thing that tells you the rest of who she was. The driver in the crushed cab was beyond any help, and a survivor running the cold arithmetic of 40 miles on half a canteen had every reason to leave him exactly as the storm had left him and start walking while she still had the light and the strength. She did not. She got back into that ruined cab in the dying wind, with her own head bleeding and her wrist already swelling, and she did for him the small last things that the living owe the dead, straightened what could be straightened, closed his eyes, took his identification so that whatever the desert did to the truck after she was gone, his people would know, and said over him the few words she had. It cost her time she could not spare and water through the sweat of the effort, and it bought her, in any accounting Spare would have recognized, nothing at all. She did it anyway. She told me. The once she spoke of it, that a commander who walks away from her own dead to improve her odds is already carrying a heavier thing than the body, and would carry it the rest of her life, and that some weights you do not put down because the putting down is worse than the carrying. Then she climbed out of the cab for the last time and got low and read the sky and started to do the arithmetic of getting herself. And shortly the boy, out of the killing ground the storm had dropped them in. When the wind finally dropped and the dust thinned enough to show stars, she did not see them as beauty. She saw them as a map. She found the wheel of the sky and the 2 stars that point to the fixed one, and she set herself a bearing, and she started to walk not toward where she guessed help was, but toward where she knew the corridor had to be, the long shallow trough in the land that every truck in the theater drove because it was the only ground that went the right way. 40 miles of it, give or take. She started counting paces in the dark with a wrist that wouldn't bear weight and a head wound crusting in her hair, and she walked. She had gone perhaps 2 hours when she heard the boy. That is how she described him to me, the boy, though Private Aller was 19 and would not have thanked her for it. She heard him before she saw him, a sound that was not the wind, a thin broken sound off to the south of her bearing, and a smarter survivor, a colder one, might have left it alone and kept her line and her water for herself. She turned off her bearing and went to it. She found Aller half buried in the lee of a drift where the storm had tumbled him out of a truck none of us ever found, his leg wrong below the knee, shocky, talking to people who weren't there. And the officer we had written off as a clipboard knelt down in the dark with her own blood dried in her hair and her own ribs catching, and she took the boy's face in her good hand and brought him back to the world with a voice he would describe to me, weeks later from a hospital bed, as the calmest thing he had ever heard in his life. She splinted his leg with a tire iron and the sleeves cut off her own blouse. She gave him water she could not spare. And then, because he could not walk and she would not leave him, she changed her whole arithmetic. 40 miles became 40 miles, dragging 160 pounds of wounded teenager. And she did not, by his account, hesitate for even a breath before she did. At first light she found the truck. Not a running truck, a dead one. A water buffalo's prime mover that had bogged and thrown a belt and been abandoned in the storm, sitting nose down in soft sand a mile off the corridor with its doors hanging open. To me, the recovery man, a dead truck is a problem to be towed. To her, it was a hardware store. She got Aller into the shade of it and she went through it the way you go through a thing when your life is the currency. The engine was finished. But the radio in the cab was not the engine. A vehicle radio with a flattened battery and a torn antenna lead is not a working radio. But it is not nothing, either, not to someone who knows what current is and where it lives. She found the auxiliary battery still holding a charge under the seat. She spliced the torn antenna lead with wire stripped from the truck's own loom and her teeth in her one good hand. She rigged the dead set to the live battery. And a little after full sunup on the first morning, while Colonel Spare's staff at Verend was marking the corridor and carrying her as missing, a radio that the United States had written off came up keyed on the task force net, and a voice none of the duty operators could place said, calm and clear and without any panic in it at all, that this was a survivor of the convoy, that she had a casualty, and that she was walking the corridor in. I was in the recovery yard when that first call came over the net, and I will tell you that the hair stood up on my arms. The duty operator didn't know the voice. There was no call sign on it the staff recognized, no name they could match. She did not give one, not then, and I understand now exactly why. A flag officer riding a convoy under a junior cover does not announce herself over an open net into a theater where the wrong ears are always listening. She gave them a grid she'd worked out from the stars and the sun and her pace count, a casualty report on Aller, and a bearing, and then she went quiet to save the battery, and the war room erupted into the particular chaos of men who have just been told that something they filed as closed is not closed at all. Because here is the thing the desert had not yet told us, the thing that was about to walk 40 miles to tell us itself. The scattered task force, the trucks, the strongpoints, the whole strung-out mess of Verend's corridor had no clean hand on it. The storm had cut units off from each other. The second cell scare had everyone buttoned and jittery. Serials were out of contact. The strongpoint at Ledge was reporting it could see movement on its flanks, and the staff at Verend was trying to run a dozen separate emergencies through a single overworked net with the man at the top, Spare, stretched past where any one man's judgment holds. Into that, over the course of the first day and into the second, came a voice. The same calm voice. It would come up keyed for 90 seconds at a time to spare the battery, and in those 90 seconds, it would do something that none of the operators could quite account for. It would take hold. It started small. The voice gave Ledge a way to read the movement on its flank as a stray, friendly serial and not an assault, and it was right, and a strongpoint that had been 30 seconds from opening up on its own people stood down. The voice walked a lost fuel serial back onto the corridor by terrain features, calm, step by step, the way you talk a man down off a ledge. The voice asked the right question of the right operator and untangled two units that had been stepping on each other's traffic for an hour. It never raised. It never hurried. It gave orders without ever sounding like it was giving orders, and the strange thing, the thing the operators kept saying to each other, was that the net obeyed it. Men keyed up and said yes ma'am to a voice with no name and no rank attached, because everything it said turned out to be the thing that should have been done, and a frightened net will follow competence the way water follows a slope. By the second day, there were staff officers in the Varend war room who had begun, without quite admitting it to themselves, to fight the whole corridor by the guidance of a voice they believed belonged to a missing logistics lieutenant walking in with a broken wrist. I heard it myself on the recovery net patched over. I heard the voice talk a bogged wrecker, one of mine, with a green corporal at the wheel. Out of a sand trap it had no business getting into, calm and exact, where to dig, how to board the wheels, when to let the clutch out. And I sat there with the handset against my ear and felt something cold go down my spine, because I knew that voice. I had heard it for 10 seconds in my motor pool the morning of the storm, a woman with dust already on her collar asking me, plainly, where the recovery rally point was, and I had answered her without looking up from my clipboard. The clipboard I had built in my head. I put the handset down and I went and found the manifest, and I read the line about the inspecting officer again. The line I had decided didn't matter. And for the first time I felt the floor of the day tilt under me, because the voice steadying the entire scattered task force across 40 miles of the collat, the voice the war room was quietly obeying, was the voice of the officer my own commander had ordered me to stop looking for. I learned the particulars of those first 2 days slowly, over years, in the flat, unhurried pieces she let fall the few times our paths crossed, and in the longer account Aller gave me from his hospital bed, and again later, when he had healed and made a life and still could not talk about her without his voice going careful. Between them I assembled the procedure of it, and the procedure is the thing I most want set down, because the procedure is the proof. Anyone can survive a day in the desert by luck. No one walks 40 miles out of the collat dragging a casualty by luck. What she did by reading the ground the way I read a broken truck, and I am a recovery man. So let me tell you what reading the ground looked like, because it is the most competent thing I have ever heard described, and she described it as though she were reading a grocery list. She navigated by the sky at night and by the land in the day, and she never trusted either alone. At night, she had the fixed star and the wheel around it. And she walked a bearing off it, but she did not just walk the bearing. She counted her pace. A tally she kept on a strip of cargo strap with knots, because she knew that a bearing without a distance is a wish, and a survivor who knows her direction but not how far she has come is a survivor who walks past her own rescue in the dark. By day she navigated by the corridor itself, the long shallow trough in the hardpan that every truck in the theater had pressed into the ground over years of movement, and she stayed off the center line of it. That was the discipline that kept her alive, because the center line was where the abandoned vehicles were, and where the abandoned vehicles were was where the enemy sweep would come. She walked the broken ground on the flank of the corridor, slower, harder, in and out of the low cuts and behind the drifts, trading speed for cover at every step, and she did the trade the same way every time, without ever once being tempted by the easy open ground that would have let her make better time toward the water her body was screaming for. The desert offers you shortcuts the way a card sharp offers you a sure thing. She refused every one. The radio was the piece that I, of all people, understood the value of, and the piece that tells you most about who she was. A vehicle radio with a flat battery and a torn antenna lead is, to 99 men out of 100, a dead weight bolted into a dead truck. She looked at it and saw a circuit with 3 problems, and she solved them one at a time the way you eat an impossible task, in bites. Problem 1 was power. The prime mover's main battery was flat, but she knew, because she knew vehicles, because a commander who inspects a supply line for a living knows what is bolted where in the trucks that run it, that the auxiliary battery for the radio and the lights lived under the seat on its own circuit, and she pulled the seat and found it holding. Problem 2 was the antenna. The lead was torn at the base where the storm had whipped the whip mount, and a radio with a severed antenna lead transmits into nothing. So she stripped insulation off the truck's own wiring loom with a multi-tool and her teeth, because the hand that could grip could not also hold and cut, and she spliced the lead, twisted and folded and bound it, and tested it the only way she could, by listening. Problem 3 was discipline. She had one charge in that auxiliary battery and no way to know how much. And so she made a rule and she kept it for 2 days under conditions that would have made any of us abandon it. 90 seconds. No more. And only when 90 seconds would do real work. She hoarded that battery the way she hoarded her water and her steps, because she understood that the radio was not for comfort and not for crying out. The radio was a tool for fighting the corridor, and you do not waste a tool's charge on your own fear. That is the thing the operators felt without being able to name it. When the voice came up on the net, it never wasted a word, never asked how they were, never explained itself, never spent a second of that precious battery on anything but the next right action. And a net full of frightened men felt the weight of that economy and leaned into it without knowing they were leaning into the rationing of a dying battery by a commander who had decided exactly what each 90 seconds was worth. She talked Ledge down off its own trigger because Ledge mattered. She walked the lost fuel serial home because the fuel serial mattered. She did not come up on the net to say she was hurt or thirsty or afraid, though she was all three, because none of those things in her accounting were worth the charge. I have spent my life around tough men. I had never encountered toughness that expressed itself as arithmetic until I encountered hers, second-hand, over a patched recovery net, and felt the hair stand up on my arms. The enemy sweep was the part that frightened Aller most in the telling, because Aller, drifting in and out on a broken leg, mostly knew it as the long stretches where she would press his shoulder, once hard, which meant be silent and be still, and they would lie in a cut behind a drift for an hour, 2 hours, while small disciplined sounds moved across the hardpan nearby, the scuff of men who knew the ground, the low murmur of a fighting patrol working the corridor for the salvage the storm had scattered. She had clocked them the first night, and she never lost track of them after, and she moved Aller around the edge of their pattern for the better part of 2 days, never crossing their line, never moving when they might hear, threading a wounded boy and herself through the middle of an armed enemy patrol by patience and terrain, and the iron refusal to hurry. She could have made far better time if she had ignored them. She would also have been found and the boy with her, and the whole walk would have ended in the worst way the desert has. So she did not ignore them. She did the slow thing, the safe for the mission thing, the thing that cost her time and water and an enormous toll of will, because the fast thing was the thing that got you killed, and a commander does not trade the mission for her own relief. The second night was the one she nearly didn't survive, and she told it to me with fewer words than any other part, the way people do with the parts that came closest. The water was gone. Hers and the dead trucks both. She'd given most of it to Aller, who needed it more, and what was left she'd rationed down to wet lips and a mouthful at the worst of the heat. The boy could not walk. She had rigged a drag from the truck's floor mats and a length of cargo strap, a kind of low sledge, and she pulled him over the hardpan a few hundred yards at a stretch, then went back ahead to scout the ground, then came back for him, so that every mile of corridor she made cost her 3 miles of walking on a body that was running out of the things a body runs on. Her wrist had swollen to where she could not close the hand. Her lips had split. The head wound had stopped bleeding and started to ache in a deep way she did not like. And the cold came down on the second night the way it does on the collat, hard and total, the day's furnace flipping to a knife, and she lay in the lee of a drift with the boy pressed against her for the warmth they had between them, and she did the arithmetic again, the way she always did, and the arithmetic that night said she might not make it, and almost certainly would not make it if she kept carrying him. She kept carrying him. She told me that part the way she told everything, flat, no heat in it, as though it were the only line of the equation that did not require solving. The arithmetic says no and you do it anyway, she said, because the other answer is a thing you cannot live with. She did not frame it as courage. She framed it as accounting. There are debts, she said, that come due whether or not the ledger balances, and a commander who leaves a wounded man in the sand to improve her own odds has already lost the only thing worth bringing home. So she lay in the cold with a dying battery and a broken hand and a boy who had stopped making sense. And somewhere in the worst of that night, she keyed the radio one more time, 90 seconds, and steadied a strong point at ledge that was again convinced it was about to be hit. And her voice on that transmission, the operators said later, did not have a single crack in it. They were tracking her by then. They had been triangulating her grids across 2 days, and they could see on the map that the voice running their corridor was getting closer to the wire, a few miles a night, dragging something, slowing, and not one of them, not yet, knew that the calm they were leaning on belonged to a woman who at that hour was deciding, mile by mile, whether to spend the last of herself on a teenager she had found in a drift. It was Aller who told me the rest of that second night, when he was strong enough to talk about it, and I have to set down his account because it is the one piece of the story I have from inside the drag, from the man she would not leave. He said he came up out of the shock in the cold dark with no idea where he was or how long it had been, and the first thing he was aware of was her voice, low, close to his ear, telling him his name and his unit, and that he was going to be all right. The same handful of facts repeated in a calm, flat litany whenever he started to drift toward the place a body goes when it has decided to quit. He said she never let him quit. Every time the cold or the pain pulled him under, the voice was there, patient, certain, giving him a job, squeeze my hand, count with me, tell me your sister's name again, small tethers to the world, one after another all night. He said he understood lying there, that she was spending herself to keep him spent slower, that every word she gave him was a word she did not have to give, and he could not understand why a stranger would do it. And he asked her, somewhere in the worst of the cold, why she didn't just go on without him and send help back. He said she was quiet for a moment, and then she told him in that same level voice that help was not a thing you sent back for a man, help was a thing you were. And then she told him to count again, and he counted, and the night went on. He said the thing he would never forget was that she did not once, in 2 days and 2 nights, let him see her afraid. He was 19 and shattered and certain he was going to die in that drift, and the one fixed point in his whole reeling world was a woman with a broken hand and her own blood in her hair who behaved, every hour, as though their survival were a foregone conclusion that simply required the correct sequence of steps, and who then executed the steps. He said you cannot panic next to a person like that. The calm comes off them and into you. He said he has tried in the years since to be that for other people, the fixed calm point, and he has learned how hard it is, and learning how hard it is has only made him understand better what she gave him for free across 2 nights when she had nothing to spare. Inside the wire those same 2 days, the war room was watching a different version of the same story, and I have pieced that side together from the operators and the staff who were in it. They had a map, and on the map they had been plotting the grids the voice gave them, one a night, and what the map showed them was a track. A slow, deliberate, unmistakable track moving up the corridor toward Verand at the pace of someone walking and dragging, a few miles a night, threading the broken ground on the flank rather than the open center line. They could see on that map that the voice running their corridor was getting closer and slower, and that it was avoiding the very ground the enemy sweep was working, and there was an argument in that war room, low and tense, about who the voice belonged to. The simplest answer was the one on the manifest, the missing inspecting officer walking in. But there were men in that room who had begun to doubt the simple answer, because the voice did not behave like a junior officer. It commanded. It gave Ledge guidance and Ledge took it. It untangled units and untangled them correctly. It moved the corridor the way a person moves a thing they own, and a major in the operations shop said out loud, late on the second day, the sentence that started the whole thing unraveling. Lieutenants do not talk like that. No one had an answer for him. They had a voice that fought their corridor better than they could, and a name on a manifest that did not fit it. And the gap between the two sat in that war room like a held breath, and no one yet had the clearance or the courage to go pull the file that would close it. By the third dawn she could see the wire. The corridor bent around a low shoulder of ground some 6 miles out from Varennes, and from the top of that shoulder in the gray before the sun, she could see the camp, the berms, the antenna farm, the faint geometry of a place built by men in a country that had never asked for them. She told me she sat down on that shoulder for a moment. Just sat, not from despair. To look at it, she said, and to fix the boy's drag, and to take stock one more time. Because a survivor who stops reading the ground because she can see home is a survivor who dies in sight of it. There was an enemy sweep working the low ground between the shoulder and the wire. She had clocked them in the dark. The small, disciplined movement of men who knew the corridor was strewn with abandoned coalition vehicles full of things worth taking. And she had threaded Allah and herself around the edge of it through the night by terrain and patience, never crossing open ground when broken ground would do, never moving when stillness was cheaper. The last 6 miles, the ones in sight of home, were the most dangerous of the 40, and she walked them the way she had walked all of it. Slow, low, exact, refusing every shortcut that the part of her that wanted water and warmth and an end to it kept offering. I was on the gate that morning. I had not slept in 2 days. I had been listening to the voice on the patched net the whole time, and somewhere in the second night I had stopped telling myself it might not be her and started, in a way I could not have explained to Colonel Spare or to anyone, standing watch, going to the wire in the cold to look out along the corridor as though looking could pull her in. So I was there at the recovery gate when the sentry beside me went still and said, "Low, Sergeant," and pointed, and I turned and looked down the corridor into the rising sun and saw 2 shapes come up out of the heat shimmer at the bottom of the shoulder. One upright, one being dragged, coming on slow and steady and not stopping. I have stood at a lot of gates and watched a lot of people come in off a lot of bad ground. I have never watched anything like that walk. She came up the corridor in the early light with the boy on the drag behind her, her left arm cradled against her ribs, her uniform torn down to the cut-off sleeves she'd splinted him with, her hair stiff and dark with old blood, her lips cracked white, moving at a pace that never changed, not faster as the wire got close, not slower as the body failed. The exact measured pace of someone who had decided how she was going to cover this ground 3 days ago and had never once let the desert renegotiate it. The sweep had melted off into the broken country with the dawn. The corridor was empty and gold, and there was just her, walking, dragging a wounded boy out of 40 miles of nothing on the strength of her own arithmetic. And I keyed the gate net with a voice that did not work right, and I said, "Recovery has eyes on 2 survivors inbound on the corridor," and I went out through the wire to meet her at something close to a run. I got to her about 100 yards out. I reached for the drag to take the boy, and she did not let go of it. She looked at me, and I knew her then, the dust on the collar, the soft old canteen, the level steady eyes I had not bothered to look at in the motor pool 3 days before, and she said, in the voice the whole task force had been obeying for 2 days, perfectly calm, that the casualty was a closed femur fracture and shock, that he needed fluids and a litter and a surgeon in that order, and that I should get my medics moving and not waste the steps. She gave me a casualty handoff. 40 miles out of the desert with nothing left in her, and the first thing she did was run the report clean, prioritize the wounded, and decline to be the emergency. I got the medics. I got the litter. And when they finally lifted the boy off her drag, and she had watched them start the fluids and seen with her own eyes that he would live, only then did she let the part of her that had been holding the whole thing up set it down, not collapse, not tears, just a long breath let out slow, and a small unsteadiness in the one hand that worked, instantly closed, as she turned to walk the last 100 yards in on her own feet, because she would be carried through no gate. What happened inside the wire I watched from 6 feet away and will carry to my grave. They had her in the aid station, the medics working her over, and word had gone up the chain that the missing voice had walked in, and Colonel Spare came down to the aid station, The way a commander comes to look at a problem that has resolved itself better than he deserved. He came in dry and careful and a little braced, a man ready to be magnanimous to a lucky lieutenant, and he started to say something about her remarkable effort, and one of his own staff officers, a major from the personnel shop, gray-faced, holding a folder he had just pulled at higher headquarters direction, stepped in front of him and said, "Sir," and handed him the folder. And the folder was her sealed file. I did not see the pages. I saw Spare's face read them. I have seen a man's face change before: fear, grief, the slow arrival of bad news. But I had never seen a man's whole understanding of where he stood in the world come apart in real time. And that is what I watched happen to Colonel Aldous Spare in the aid station at Camp Varand. Because the file did not say Logistics Lieutenant. The inspecting officer riding the convoy under a junior cover, the clipboard I had built in my head, the one not worth the fuel, was a flag officer, the deep cover commander of the joint task force that Varand and Ledge and the whole corridor answered to. Riding the supply line unannounced, and under a sealed cover precisely because that was the only way to see how a thing was really run rather than how the slides claimed. Her record ran to combat tour we had no clearance to know about, commands held, a call sign on the classified pages that the men who had served under her in another theater had given her years before, Tidewater, for the way she came in steady and turned the worst tides, slow and certain and impossible to stop. The voice the war room had been obeying for 2 days without knowing why had been obeying it, because the net, in its fear, had recognized something the paperwork had hidden. It was being commanded by the person whose job it was to command it, walking the last 40 miles of her own corridor on foot. Spare came to attention. I want that recorded plainly, because it is the truest thing I have to give. The hard, dry, careful colonel who had told me one logistics officer was not worth the fuel stood up straight in that aid station with the folder shaking very slightly in his hand, and he came to attention in front of the woman his task force had written off, and he could not, this is the part I remember most, he could not raise his eyes to her face. He held the attention and he looked at the middle distance over her shoulder and his jaw worked and nothing came out, because there is no sentence a man can say to the commander he abandoned in the sand, and Spare, to whatever credit is left to him, did not try to manufacture one. He stood at attention and he ate it, and she let him. She did not absolve him and she did not lash him. She acknowledged the attention with a small nod, the senior person receiving what is due, and she held his discomfort in the room without enjoying it, because she had enough and did not need to take his dignity to feel her own. It moved through the camp the way those things move. The major came to attention. The medics, who a moment before had been working on a patient, straightened and stood. Word reached the war room and the staff officers who had been quietly running her corridor by her voice came down the line and stood, and the operators who had said yes ma'am to a voice with no name stood, and out in the recovery yard my own men, hearing it, set down what they were holding and stood. It was not ordered. No one called the camp to attention. It happened the way water finds its level, man by man. The whole apparatus that had folded her chair against the table 3 nights before now rising to its feet for her one piece at a time, until the only person at Camp Varand who was not standing at attention for the commander we had abandoned was the commander herself, sitting on an aid station cot with a splinted wrist and her blood dried in her hair, taking it in with those level eyes. And finally, when the whole room had come up and held, returning the salute of the camp at one stroke, and dropping her hand last, the way the senior person does, the way she had earned the right to 100 times over across 40 miles none of us had walked with her. I have tried many times to describe what it was like to stand in that, and the closest I can come is this. It did not feel like triumph. There was no triumph in the room. It felt like a debt being acknowledged, the way you feel when you have wronged someone and they are decent enough to let you stand up straight and own it rather than grinding you down. She could have ground us down. She had every right to. She had walked 40 miles out of the desert that her own task force had abandoned her to, dragging a boy we had written off beside her, and she had come back to find her authority signed away to a subordinate, and her name moved to the missing annex with 2 keystrokes, and any anger she felt would have been just. But there was no anger in that aid station. There was a tired woman receiving the attention of men who had failed her, and accepting it without cruelty and without false grace, and that absence of cruelty in someone who held every card was the most commanding thing in a day full of commanding things. The men who had to tell you what they were, the ready-room talkers, the ones who needed the rank on the collar to be seen, she was the opposite of all of them. She had never told us. She had let us decide she was furniture, and she had walked 40 miles, and let the desert correct us, and even now, standing the whole camp up, she did not say a word about who she was. The file said it. She just sat there and let the truth of her be louder than anything she could have claimed. I came to attention too. I want to be honest about where I stood in that room at the back by the door, the recovery NCO who had found the boot print and known what it meant, and turned his records around anyway. She found me before she left. They were going to fly her out to a real hospital, and she would not go until she had seen the boy stabilized and the corridor handed off clean, and on her way to the bird she stopped in front of me. I could not look at her any better than Spare had. I started to say the thing I had been building for 3 days, the apology, the boot print, the order, the part of me that had almost believed it, and she stopped me with one word. She said my name, she had it. She had read it off my motor pool sign 3 days before. She forgot nothing. And then she said only that recovery had pulled 40 vehicles and most of their people out of a storm that erased a column, and that the work I had done while she was walking had been good work, and that the corridor was whole this morning in part because of it. She gave me the thing I had not earned and did not ask for. She took the worst day of my life and she handed me back the piece of it I could carry. The men she covers never see her. Someone wrote of her once in a file I was not cleared to read. She watched over them and asked nothing back. I believe it. I was one of them. I have thought in the years since about why she did it that way, why she didn't break Spare on the spot, why she handed me back my dignity when I had helped take hers, why a woman with a flag officer's stars and a call sign that froze a war room spent the worst of herself, dragging a private named Aller across the collat when the arithmetic told her to leave him. I think I finally understand it, and it is the thing I try to teach the young ones now, the recovery soldiers who come through Varand looking at the supply line the way I once did, like a gas station. Real skill is quiet, I tell them, because it doesn't need an audience. She ran an entire scattered task force for 2 days off 90-second transmissions and never once said her own rank. And real strength is generous, I tell them, because it has enough to give away. She gave the boy her water and gave Spare his silence and gave me back my good name, and none of it cost her anything she could not spare, because she was that full. The man who has to tell you what he is, I tell them, isn't it yet? She never told us. She walked 40 miles and let the desert tell us for her. They ask me how she is, sometimes, the young ones, when they've heard the story. I tell them I don't know, that flag officers with call signs on sealed pages do not send Christmas cards to recovery sergeants, and that I would not presume. But I tell them this, which is the part I am sure of. There's a record at Varand that says the recovery was suspended at 21:30 owing to deteriorating conditions and the low probability of survival, and that record is true, and it is the most shameful sentence I have ever put my name to, and I would not erase it if I could, because the answer to it walked in 3 mornings later out of 40 miles of nothing, dragging a wounded boy she would not leave, and stood a whole camp on its feet without raising her voice, and dropped her hand last. We wrote her off as not worth the fuel. She came back and was worth more than all of us, and she never once said so, and that is the difference, I tell them, between the people who wear the rank and the people who are it. Then I send them out to the wire to learn the corridor, and I stand a minute longer than I need to, looking down the gold of it toward the shoulder where 2 shapes came up out of the heat one morning and changed what I thought I knew about who matters, and I drop my hand last every time for her. I never learned to do it for the people I could see. She taught me to do it for the ones I couldn't, the furniture, the clipboards, the ones passing through on their way to somewhere that matters more, the ones it would cost me nothing to look up and see. I look up now. That is the whole of what she left me, and it is more than I had any right to, and I have tried every day since to be worth the grid I gave her without lifting my eyes.